Well, longing to belong is the topic of our worship today, and it fuels so much of our human activity. Social work researcher Brene Brown notes that since human beings are a social species by nature, we can't survive without one another. Love and belonging, therefore, are irreducible needs for all people. No wonder we tell stories about belonging, sing songs about finding one's place, finding one's people. This truly is the stuff of a hero's journey. Indeed, our Wonderbox and today's musical selection sing to the power of the journey for an individual to find belonging. Part of the hero's story is the story of growing up and differentiating from one's family. Learning what makes you, you. Learning this can create tension between who you once were or who you are expected to be by a family, by a community, by what was set out for you long before you got to know who you were. And learning this often leads us to a new community, like in the children's story about the narwhals and the unicorns. Today, let us consider two aspects of the human quest to belong. And the first is the difference between belonging and fitting in. Brene Brown defines belonging as being accepted for who you are. It is being somewhere where you want to be and they want you. She defines it in opposition to fitting in. Fitting in is being accepted for being like everyone else. Fitting in is being somewhere that you want to be, but the people there don't care one way or the other. Fitting in can happen in places like schools, churches, sports teams. Fitting in can also happen in families. When you place pressure on yourself or your family places pressures on you, loving or otherwise, to live up to their expectations for your life and your personality. Fitting in, rather than belonging, is one reason that we can feel lonely in the crowd, lonely in our own family. An example of that comes from author George M. Johnson, who describes in his memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue, about growing up as a Black and queer man in central New Jersey. Where he attended school, the boys were on the sports field playing football, and the girls were double dutching, except for Johnson, who was skipping rope with a big smile on his face. One day during recess, a male friend came to him and said that the other boys were calling him names for playing with the girls. He describes feeling faced with a choice that day: be true to himself or not. To endure humiliation and bullying by being himself, or to fit in with the norms and survive a little easier. He described that moment of self-betrayal, hiding something he loved from his peers in order to fit in and protect himself from bullying. Naturally athletic, he excelled on the football field that first day that he played with the boys. The teasing let up, but on that day, he sacrificed an allegiance to himself. How many of us here have memories like that? Brene Brown says that a paradox of belonging is that we can only feel it when we also experience self-acceptance. So longing for belonging is often a twofold path. We have to find community where we can belong, where that's possible, and we have to find communities where we can practice self-acceptance and grow into our own self-regard. where we can practice self-acceptance, self-love, and where we know it is okay to be hurt and okay to be healing. In writing that memoir, George M. Johnson offered healing and self-acceptance to that part of him who loved to jump double dutch, even if he wasn't able to accept and express that part of himself with his peers in his youth in order to survive. Thing is, finding community is a risk. Last week, I preached about coming into Unitarian Universalist churches in my 20s and feeling a little embarrassed to attend church. That decision to go to church was because I felt isolated at the time. I felt like something was missing because I was feeling lonely even when I was with other people. I was attracted to the values of UU communities, but that alone didn't awaken a sense of belonging. As I already belonged to groups of peers that I thought might judge me for going to church, this was a tenuous time in my life. But what made the difference at that Unitarian Universalist church, what opened me up to self-acceptance and healed the parts of me that felt so alone, were the individual people in those communities who offered me their love, their companionship, and their acceptance. It was in Peter, who did invite me to join the choir that day. It was in Betsy, who invited me to newcomer events. And it was Emily Joy, who hosted young adult potlucks and sing-alongs. These relationships allowed me to feel belonging. A challenge of belonging in Unitarian Universalist communities is that not everyone feels as included as I did so effortlessly. The truth is that just like in our wider culture, Unitarian Universalist communities are places where exclusion can occur for people with marginalized identities. Sometimes exclusion happens intentionally and sometimes not. Either way, its results can be, on one hand, that we experience being disregarded, dismissed, or left out, or on another, that we experience being attacked or threatened. In 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association issued the report Widening the Circle of Concern. The report detailed how people of color, disabled people, and people of diverse gender and sexual orientations have experienced exclusion in our congregations. A group from our congregation studied that report last year over many months, and based on that, made recommendations to the Board of Trustees for activities that our church could do to become more welcoming. And one response is to organize a social justice summit happening at the end of October, and details about that will be available soon. That prompted me to want to look back at our history a little bit, and I was moved by the story of one of our ancestors about creating communities of belonging when he himself was excluded from participation. Reverend Dean Starr was born in 1923 and had a long career as a minister, beginning as a Universalist, serving in Massachusetts churches in Medford, Sherborne, Acton, and Harvard. He was the father of 6 with his ex-wife Wilma and came out as a gay man in the 1970s. At the time, being gay meant that he was unlikely to be accepted for work in a congregational setting. Well, there wasn't a rule book saying no gay ministers allowed. Our congregational polity meant that every church made a decision about which ministers to hire, and no congregation had yet to call an openly gay minister to lead their church. So, in fact, we did have a practice of exclusion. Reverend Starr served instead in an appointed position as district executive for Vermont and New Hampshire, and perhaps some of you got to know him in that capacity. He passed away in 1996. Reverend Starr did not fit in to the expectations of what a congregation expected of their minister, but he belonged as a minister in our denomination. He belonged as a Unitarian Universalist because of his beliefs and values, and he offers this wisdom to people and congregations for creating relationships where belonging, not just fitting in, is possible. Vengerflutta will share those with you.
10 suggestions for a healthy congregation. Always be kind to one another, even if you think meanness is justified. Always attribute the best possible motives to one another, even when you do not understand one another's words and actions. Promise to one another only what you really intend and are capable of delivering. Laugh and cry together, sharing both your joys and heartaches. Be very quick to praise one another and very slow to criticize. Defend one another, but avoid being defensive. Avoid that. Accept one another's gifts with gratitude, but accept one another's deficiencies with grace. Do not tell one another how to feel. Remember that feelings are facts and treat them accordingly. Greet each new day with expectation and each hour of rest with thanksgiving. Let your eyes light up when you come into one another's presence.
How poignant that someone with such wisdom was excluded from ministering to a congregation. These suggestions are best practiced in community. And the community here on Sunday mornings is one aspect of church life, but there is so much more beyond Sunday worship. And I want to invite you, if you haven't opened up your email newsletter in a while, to please do so and take a look at the faith formation programs coming up for children, youth, and adults. And if you don't receive an email newsletter from us and you want to, you can let the Zoom host know or tell an usher or a greeter here in person. In October, a newcomers covenant group will start up. Covenant groups are small groups that meet regularly to delve into deeper conversation about each month's worship themes. In October, both poetry group and spiritual practices groups will begin again, and those meet weekly on Zoom. And the twice monthly grief group will continue to meet on Wednesday evenings. In October, I'll offer a new to UU class if you'd like to learn more about the history of this religion or this church in particular. And if you like to be active, there will be a Mine Falls Park Walk in October, and the church will have a team participating in a walk to end hunger called the Crop Walk. If you are artistic, the gallery in the fellowship hall is open again for displaying artwork by members and friends of UU Nashua. I wonder where in this community you will express your true self this year. And I say all that because it's not easy to create belonging. We have to try it and make mistakes. We have to come together seeking it and sometimes not find it, and sometimes experience the disappointment of that. And that's all well and good. That's just part of what it means to take that risk to be part of a community. But I told you when we started that I did want to talk about two aspects of belonging. And the other one is about what exclusion can do when it is not just happening in one particular small community like a school or a church, but it's happening in our wider political and social systems. So our news feeds and newspapers are showing us many headlines about exclusion happening in that larger context of the world. And what can we as Unitarian Universalists do to respond to that? Well, right here in Nashua in August, the city was visited by members of a New Hampshire-based neo-Nazi group. And many of you quickly mobilized to attend a Hate Has No Home Here rally the following weekend, including a performance by our choir. When we see exclusion at work in the headlines, we also see it in political conflicts like the war in the Ukraine and tensions in Israel and Palestine. Unchecked, the exclusion of a group of people leads to hate. Exclusion can lead to dehumanization, creating an enemy image of the other person or the other side. Philosopher Michel Macy offers this definition of dehumanization as, quote, the psychological process of demonizing the enemy, making them seem less than human, hence not worthy of human treatment. Macy goes on to note that dehumanization begins with language and images. When it takes hold, it results in moral exclusion. The targeted group is no longer worthy of being protected by a shared moral code. The Australian poet Francis Dugan offers this warning about exclusionary language and its dangers in the poem Marginalization of Minorities, which Vengerflutta will read.
Most of us are addictive, or so it does seem, and so many suffer of low self-esteem. Big Brother's disciples judge us every day, and many of us worry of what others of us say. Those into public shaming are ignorant and cruel, the humiliation of others to their egos fuel. And sad to think that their type have never been rare. There are plenty of them in the big world out there. In a world where minorities are marginalized and freedom of speech is becoming despised, we have to take care of the words that we say. Democracy is dead in the world of today. The government we elect, they do prey on our fear. In their own cunning ways, they say the things we want to hear. They create the barriers of us against they. Respect to a fair go, they never do pay. Patriotism and religion and national pride, and all of this talk about God on our side. And the marginalization of minorities, it is worldwide. And the things that unite us from others, us divide.
That poem was written about 15 years ago, and that sense of division and exclusion has only intensified. Because when we bring it back to what Brené Brown says, humans have an innate need for belonging. And that need can be manipulated. We can be manipulated to want to belong to the strong man, to the right side. Most people who engage in hateful acts don't think of themselves as cruel people. They hate because for them, that is a misguided act of love of something. Love of the strong man, the right side, a deeply held belief, letting down their family, letting down their profession. Or it can be an act of fear, the fear of lost belonging, the fear of exclusion, of humiliation, of rejection. How can peace-loving people like us, how can peace-loving people, people who long to belong and also long to create communities of belonging, how can we respond to acts of exclusion and division? Acts that too often are a gateway to hatred and dehumanization of others. Civil rights activist and lawyer Valerie Kaur is the author of See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love. Kaur is a Sikh American, and her activism stems from her experiences of the increase in violence towards members of her religious community following September 11th, 2001. Kaur invites us to reframe divisiveness and to understand someone who excludes us as an opponent, not an enemy. She says, quote, "The word enemy implies permanence, but opponent is fluid." This is essential advice for Unitarian Universalists because our values guide us to see the dignity in every person. Kaur says, "We have a range of opponents at any time, distant and near." So there are opponents to the values that many of us in this room hold dear, many of you on Zoom hold dear. And Kaur counsels us that the first way to respond to feeling or noticing these acts of exclusion is to tend the wound that it causes. Finding a safe person or place to express the rage and pain of hurtful acts of exclusion. To release rage, she describes solo activities like pounding on a pillow or releasing tears of rage in a room where she knows she's safe and can be by herself if she needs some space. To acknowledge the hurt, she might reach out to trusted friends or organizing partners. After tending the wound, the next activity she suggests is to wonder about the opponent. She says, quote, "I remember that I do not need to feel empathy or compassion for my opponent in order to practice loving them. Love is labor that begins in wonder. So I wonder about them. Beneath the slogans and the sound bites, I begin to hear their pain and understand the wounds behind their words. I see their humanity. I see no stranger. When listening gets hard, I focus on taking the next breath. Listening does not grant the other side legitimacy. It grants them humanity, and it preserves my own." From here, we can find our courage to speak. From here, we can act on our own values, even when their words threaten, even when we feel afraid. Because we are called in this faith, as Reverend Starr says, to defend one another. And as we widen our circle of community, to defend our community. Dorothy Day says, "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and love comes with community." This love is not easy. It is not perfect. The mission of this congregation is one we can carry out when we spend time together, when we allow one another the space to be accepted as we are, to grow in self-acceptance and thus to grow in belonging. And when we do that, that lets us carry our mission not just to the folks that we see on Zoom or we see here at church, but out into our wider world. When we cultivate our inner depth, it makes more room for us to have that strength to go out into the community, to be a courageous community, one that is able to respond to opponents who would exclude and divide. A community that is able to identify dangers and deficits and respond with acts of service and justice. So I hope that you will continue to come here on Sunday mornings and let this worship be a space where we let our troubles breathe and make room for the wonder that makes it possible to love so courageously. And may we remember that church can be, and you are welcome to make it much more than Sunday worship. May it be so.